4. Masayuki, Yoko said the next morning as she bustled about preparing for her classes. Did you win the lottery or something? You're positively glowing. Between bites of a croissant, Kawashima explained that he'd slept like a dead man. This was true, and his appetite was back as well, much to his own surprise. There was no way to be 100% sure of not getting caught. This had been his first thought on waking. But merely wounding some woman was out of the question. If she lived, she'd surely go to the police, and that would be it for him. He'd mulled over such problems while brushing his teeth and washing his face. You know, he told Yoko as he dressed for work, our company has adopted the mandatory vacation system, like a lot of the bigger firms have. You mean where you have to take time off whether you want to or not? Exactly. At some of the big agencies, it's for a whole month, or even 2. But for us, it's more like a week or 10 days. It was a fact that Kawashima's firm had such a system, mandatory vacation for all employees once every 3 to 5 years. A fund had been set aside for that purpose, and a certain amount of cash was available for expenses, depending upon how you plan to spend your vacation. I've got an idea I want you to work on, he said. So I was thinking about taking mine soon. When? Like beginning the day after tomorrow or so. That is soon. But you're not supposed to just lie around the house, right? No, and you're not to show up at the office either. You have to come up with some sort of goal, something you're going to do with your time. Not that it has to be anything that serious. One guy traveled to India, and another went to New York to check out the musicals. One of the girls flew down to Okinawa to get her scuba diving license. Are you going overseas? Here's what I was thinking. I'd like to stay in one of the major hotels downtown. You don't get a chance to do that when you live in the city, right? I'd like to stay in the sort of place where your average salaryman from smaller cities stay when they come to Tokyo. What are you going to do in a place like that? This might sound silly, but I want to get a better understanding of the true salaryman, like when I have a meeting in a coffee shop or bar in one of those hotels. I'm always fascinated by what the salarymen around me are talking about. You'd be surprised. A lot of times you hear some pretty poignant, heartfelt stuff. I'd like to make, a serious study of that sort of thing. Because beginning the year after next, we're going to be in charge of all the graphics on a new campaign. It's for an imported car, a new model targeting salarymen in their 30s. And the fact is, I don't really know that much about your average salaryman. He needed a solid chunk of time in order to hone and execute his plan. But if he made up some story about having to stay near the office for days at a time to meet a deadline, for example, one phone call from Yoko to the office, and he'd be busted. It was unlikely that anyone might connect that lie with a crime that took place somewhere across town, but he didn't need to complicate things by giving Yoko or the company any reason to think he was up to something fishy. Of course, staying a week at a hotel in the city for research would normally be read as an affair or a gambling problem. But he knew that Yoko would never doubt him. She wasn't the jealous or suspicious type in the first place, and the 6 years they'd known each other, though he may have kept certain things from her, he'd never told her a lie. Not because he was adhering to some abstract moral principle, but simply because he didn't want to be dishonest with someone who meant so much to him. Besides, if she should suspect him of having an affair, well, so what? Arranged neatly on the L-shaped table that dominated the room were all the implements Yoko needed to teach the day's classes. We'll have to get you packed then, she said, with a natural, unforced smile. Just be sure to keep in touch. Don't forget to call. I won't forget, Kawashima said, nodding. He walked into the bedroom and bent over the crib to peer at the baby. Lightly touching her downy cheek, he whispered, so Yoko wouldn't hear. Everything's going to be all right. 5. 4 days later, Kawashima was checking in at the Akasaka Prince Hotel. He used his JCB card and registered under his real name. It was a twin room with a view of Tokyo Tower in the distance, and he'd reserved it for a week. He'd never taken any serious vacation time before, and for that reason, and in recognition of his just having won the Jazz Festival account, the firm had immediately agreed to his request and even presented him with nearly 900,000 yen in cash for expenses. His boss had joked, in typically poor taste, that the idea of observing salarymen was brilliant, but not to fall in love with one and end up with AIDS. Kawashima checked in shortly after noon and gave Yoko a call first thing. He could hear the babble of middle-aged women in the background and could almost smell the freshly baked bread. Neither Yoko nor anyone at the office had seemed the least bit suspicious of his motives. Come to think of it, he reflected, as he sat back on the sofa and gazed out at the heart of the city settling into dusk. Come to think of it, somewhere along the line I became a man who never does anything people consider suspicious. Maybe something fundamental had changed since the old days, since parting with the stripper. He'd gone back to school, taken up drawing again, found a job, and met Yoko. And he often felt as if he wasn't even the same person he'd been as a teenager. But if he was someone different now, which of the two was the real him? They're both the real you, some part of him whispered. But the rest of him wasn't so sure. Sometimes the old and new selves seemed completely unrelated. Inspired by a magazine article he'd read and photocopied in the library, Kawashima had decided to buy a knife as well as an ice pick. The article was about a 32-year-old soap tart who'd been found murdered in a hotel room, with her Achilles tendons severed. An anonymous police detective had volunteered this explanation. When you cut the Achilles tendon, the sound it makes is as loud and sharp as a gunshot. The killer must have known that and taken pleasure in it. Kawashima decided that before stabbing the victim's stomach with an ice pick, or afterwards if need be, he'd slice her Achilles tendons. He was curious what it would sound like exactly, and he wanted to see the expression on the woman's face when it happened. Thinking about these things didn't set his pulse racing or leave him staring into space, grinning and drooling. He experienced rather a sort of creative calm similar to his state of mind when pondering which photo to use for a poster. His heartbeat had been a problem during the 10 days he'd lived in fear of stabbing the baby, but not since that night in the convenience store. Between the man who was coolly deciding to cut his victim's Achilles tendons and wondering what it would sound like, and the man who'd smiled at his wife that very morning in a room saturated with the fragrance of freshly baked bread, there was clearly a gap. Exactly what the gap consisted of he couldn't have said, but he knew there was one. He got up and closed the curtains. From his briefcase he took the magazine article, an S&M magazine, a weekly sex industry guide, and a notebook. He sat down at the desk and began making notes in an attempt to marshal his thoughts. First of all, the victim would have to be a prostitute. It was the only logical choice. But what type of prostitute should he choose? That was important, as was the question of where the killing was to take place. He'd been hauled in by the cops once, years ago, for sniffing thinner, but they'd never taken his fingerprints. The cops were at a big disadvantage when a murderer wasn't acquainted with the victim and had no previous record. He'd already determined that he couldn't just stab the woman, he had to be sure and kill her. Naturally, it would be best if her body were never discovered, but trying to dispose of the corpse would involve unacceptable risks. She'd have to be a freelancer with no pimp or office or syndicate to report to. Stab her in some dark, deserted alley, maybe? Luring a streetwalker into an alley under the pretense of negotiating a price would be simple enough. But in such a dimly lit place, he wouldn't have a clear view of the ice pick puncturing her stomach, and he probably wouldn't have time to slash her Achilles tendons. Walking through the Kabukicho district of Shinjuku 2 nights ago, He'd confirmed that most of the freelance streetwalkers were from overseas, particularly Southeast Asia. Among the advantages of choosing such a woman was the fact that any search for her would be half-hearted at best, since she was unlikely even to be in Japan legally. But it was essential that the flesh he pierced with the ice pick be as white as possible. And now that he thought about it, not even a fair-skinned foreigner would do. If the victim didn't speak Japanese well, it would be difficult to set things up properly. And besides, it was imperative that her expressions of terror and anguish be in Japanese. Why? He wondered about that for a moment, but stopped when an image of his mother threatened to form in his mind. He must concentrate only on the business at hand. No, it would be insane to do it in an alley or park or vacant lot, or anywhere outdoors. He'd have to get a separate room somewhere. The sex businesses that would send girls to a customer's hotel room were limited to soap dart services, erotic massage operations, and S&M clubs. As soon as the ice pick made its appearance, the woman was likely to try to flee and to scream. She'd have to be restrained, and for an extended period of time, since she wouldn't die right away. After all, he wasn't going to be stabbing her in the heart. It would be best to watch her expire slowly from loss of blood, but of course you couldn't get that much blood flow from ice pick wounds. You could cause death by internal bleeding, puncturing certain organs, but what good was that if you couldn't watch it happening? In any case, the first step would be to get the woman tied up and gagged. That meant S&M. Apparently most S&M clubs wouldn't send their girls to love hotels. The advantage of a love hotel was the shutter at the front desk that prevents the attendant from seeing your face. But the staff at places like that were always on the lookout for trouble, understandably enough. And Kawashima had read somewhere that occasionally, if a call girl's office grew concerned about a situation and phoned the hotel, someone would actually go up to the room to check on her. Besides, if anything did go wrong, the narrow little entrance and reception area would only make escape more difficult. And love hotels tended to be on quieter streets, with only scattered couples strolling discreetly up and down, so it wasn't as if you could run out and melt seamlessly into the crowd. At a regular hotel, on the other hand, they'd see his face at the front desk, and he'd have to leave his handwriting on a registration card. But he could reserve a room using a fake name and telephone number, and they'd never know the difference, as long as he checked in on time. He confirmed this today, here at the Akasaka Prince. He'd given them his work number and a check-in time of 2 o'clock in the afternoon when making the reservation, and though he waited at the office until 1:45, no one called from the hotel, nor had they asked for ID. His normal handwriting was so generic that it shouldn't be a problem, provided he didn't make some idiotic mistake like leaving behind his driver's license or business card or address book, or an envelope or sheet of paper with the company's letterhead. A small but important detail. Should he let the bellboy help with whatever luggage he might have? The bellboy would offer to carry any type of bag, even a briefcase. Today he'd observed that Japanese guests seemed to enjoy having the boy take their bags, while most of the foreigners, perhaps because they're accustomed to having to tip everyone, tended to decline help if they could manage the luggage themselves. Well, the bellboy question was one he could resolve later. Kawashima wrote, "Bellboy issue pending," and turned to a new page. He'd already filled several with crabbed, dense writing. What sort of luggage should he carry, though? One smallish travel bag ought to do. He could leave the prince carrying a paper shopping bag stuffed with everything he'd need and buy a travel bag on the way to the second hotel, where the actual ritual would be performed. He'd stop at one of the major train stations, or Haneda Airport, for that matter, and purchase the most ubiquitous sort of bag possible at any one of the little shops or stands. Preferably something cheap and mass-produced, but even a popular designer bag, a Louis Vuitton, say, would work well enough. All things considered, one of the larger hotels would probably be best, and when it came to interacting with the front desk, a simple disguise might be in order. But the operative word was simple. It mustn't be anything that served to make him stand out in any way. Sunglasses, for example, might be effective, but he'd noticed here at the Prince that people who wore shades while checking in only drew attention to themselves. You got the impression they were trying to conceal their identities. Once the woman's body was discovered, the police would probably have nothing more than a rough composite sketch of the killer to go by. That shouldn't be too much of a threat, unless, while at the hotel, he were to bump into or be seen by someone who knew him. How best to minimize any danger of that happening? First of all, one ironclad rule. If, while checking in, he were to meet up with or even catch sight of a colleague from work, say, or one of Yoko's students, anyone whom it would be impossible to fool with a simple disguise, then the whole operation was off. But what specifically would the simple disguise consist of? Parting his hair differently and wearing eyeglasses with thick lenses ought to be sufficient for the neck up. But he also had to think about clothing. After meeting someone a few times, you can often recognize them even from behind, just by their body language and style of clothes. Best to buy a navy blue or grey salaryman-style suit, of the type he never wore, and maybe a cheap overcoat. He'd have to hurry on the suit. It would take some time just to have the trousers hemmed. Shoes with insoles might be a good idea too, to add a few centimeters to his height. Of course, we'll need a change of clothes as well, he wrote, since there's bound to be a good deal of blood. Taking off all our own clothes is a possibility, but it would be risky in the event of some form of active resistance on the woman's part. Besides, getting naked as the ritual was reaching a climax might be interpreted as having some sort of sexual meaning. We don't want the woman to think we're slicing through her Achilles tendons just to satisfy a perverted sexual need. She must remain uncertain as to what significance her own bloodshed and agony hold. It's vital that those on the receiving end of violence ponder its meaning. A sad and bitter but important truth. Kawashima was writing thoughts down as they occurred to him, but now he stopped himself. He went back and erased everything after need a change of clothes as well. In large, bold characters he wrote, "Thoughts irrelevant to planning and preparation have no place in this notebook." The sun had long since set, and he looked at his watch. 8 o'clock already. It's been hours, he thought, and it feels like minutes. Had he ever been this engrossed in anything before? He took a cola from the minibar, popped it open, and had a sip. He was beginning to feel as if any number of things he'd done and experienced in the past had helped prepare him for this mission. And to wonder, in fact, if this wasn't the end to which all the events of his life had been leading him. He was already beginning to forget, in other words, the original motive behind the plan: to relieve his fear of stabbing the baby. Plain jeans and a sweatshirt for the change of clothes. Nothing too baggy or bulky, however. Choose a sweatshirt of thin material, same with the jeans. 2 pairs of well-fitting leather gloves. Great care must be taken in use of gloves. Most natural to remove right-hand glove when checking in. Fortunately, no scars remain from when he'd burned his hand 10 years before. No need to be too concerned about fingerprints when he checked in either. It was unlikely anyone would remember which counter or which pen he'd used, and they'd all be covered with prints anyway. Leaving the glove on, especially while writing something, would, like sunglasses, only invite attention. It had been Kawashima's experience that whenever you were trying to hide something, others would somehow pick up on that, and surely any desk clerk would take notice of someone wearing gloves when filling out the registration card. Hotel workers were trained to be observant, and adept at pretending not to be. Assuming he declined the bellboy's help, he should take the key with his gloved hand and wear both gloves when opening the door and at all times after entering the room. He mustn't leave any fingerprints at the scene, if only to make it seem like the work of a man with a lot of experience. The police would be inclined to search for someone who had a record and make lists of known deviants and sex offenders. But of course he couldn't wear gloves from the time the woman arrived until he had her immobilized, for fear of arousing her suspicions. After tying her up, he'd put them back on. Poker-faced, naturally, slowly adjusting the black leather fingers one at a time. Then the ball gag. Not one that would completely seal her mouth. She must be allowed to vocalize in a limited way. The bloodied gloves and the jeans and sweatshirt he'd stuff in separate vinyl bags, remembering first to put on the spare pair of gloves. He'd best double or triple bag everything, which meant he'd need to collect a number of bags from convenience stores. Cloth, duct tape, cardboard, and thick paper with which to wrap the tip of the ice pick and the blade of the knife. And he'd need something to weigh the bags down when he threw them in the river. Diver's weights would be ideal. Add them to the packages with the ice pick and knife as well. Once everything had been disposed of, it might be safest to leave his travel bag near a group of homeless men in a park somewhere. In which case, of course, a Louis Vuitton was out of the question. The knife and ice pick he'd buy at separate supermarkets in the suburbs, preferably on Saturday afternoon or Sunday when they were at their busiest. Did he need to do a dry run, order up a woman from a different S&M club one time before the big night to acquaint himself with the procedure? The experience might prove useful, but there was also a slight possibility of danger. What if the first woman and the one to be sacrificed happened to be friends, for example? A long shot, maybe, but why risk it? After all, if any sort of trouble were to occur as a result of his not being familiar with S&M play, he could simply abort. He had skipped dinner but didn't feel the least bit hungry and was wondering why when the telephone rang. It was room service, checking to make sure he didn't want his bed covers turned down in spite of the Do Not Disturb sign on his door. He said he was working and would take care of the bedding himself, to which the clerk replied in the most courteous tones that bed service was available around the clock and he should feel free to request it at any time. Kawashima found himself thanking the man for his kindness and meaning it. It felt as if even people in no way involved in his mission were cheering him on. Turning back to his notebook, he wrote, "In addition to a simple disguise, a bit of misdirection might help. For the hotel workers he'd interact with, maybe something basic like noisily chewing a stick of gum, speaking with a Kansai accent, coughing frequently, limping slightly, but nothing that might prove counterproductive by leaving too distinct an impression. He'd better think this out carefully. The misdirection was an important point, and not to be ignored when it came to the final stages of the ritual either. He still hadn't decided upon a cause of death. The most orthodox method would be to strangle her. Strangling held little appeal for him, but if it came to that, he'd prefer to use a wire of thin stainless steel. Cutting her wrists or throat would be a problem in terms of the volume of blood splattered. But, on the other hand, a gory crime scene would help with the misdirection by pointing the police towards drug addicts or amphetamine users or the mentally ill. He could reinforce that by leaving a note with some sort of incoherent message. According to a magazine article he'd read concerning an actual incident, you could count on such communications employing words like God, divine will, radio waves, control, orders, commands, heaven. He combined some of these into a short note. I must do as they command, or as the radio transmissions command. Behold his divine will, or God spoke to me, or I dare not disobey my orders, or I have opened wide the portals of heaven. One of these, or some combination, would do. He could use the stationery and pen provided by the hotel. Again, no particular need to write with his left hand or otherwise disguise his writing. Just wad the note up and leave it lying in a corner of the room. It might be a good idea to collect racing forms left behind on the train, horse racing, bike racing, boat racing, and plant them in the room, especially if he could find some from Osaka or Kobe, or a flyer advertising a loan shark or something there, and used a Kansai accent when registering. He had no time to actually make a trip to the Kansai district, but when he bought his bag at Tokyo Station or Haneda Airport, he could keep an eye out for such artifacts discarded by travelers. When it came to misdirection, however, it was important to pay attention to even the smallest details. Were it to become clear that deception had been involved, the police would immediately start looking for someone rational and cunning rather than mad or desperate. He'd choose one of the hotels in West Shinjuku, where it wasn't unusual for guests to arrive on foot rather than by taxi. The Park Hyatt, the Century Hyatt, the Washington, the Hilton, the Keio Plaza. He'd make a reservation at each of them under a different name. Then, as soon as possible, he'd go check them all out. The one with the busiest front desk and the worst service would suit him best. Poor service, he wrote, means less attention focused on guests. He laid down the pencil and looked at his watch. It was past 11. Yoko would be going to bed soon. He thought about calling her again, but decided that twice in one day might seem unnatural. He still wasn't hungry. The little refrigerator was stocked with whiskey and beer, and he felt so satisfied with the work he'd done that he decided to allow himself a drink. He took a mini bottle of cheap domestic whiskey from the refrigerator, poured it into a glass, and had a sip. It was the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted. He read over his 7 pages of notes, making a few small additions, then put the notebook in the briefcase and spun the dials on the combination lock. He opened the curtains and looked at Tokyo Tower, whose lights were off now. And as he took another sip of whiskey, he was aware of the heat in his throat and stomach, radiating waves of sexual desire through his body. After the second glass, he decided not to drink any more, fearing that he might give in to the temptation to call an S&M club and have a woman sent over. He hadn't yet decided how old the victim should be. The idea of someone in her late 30s appealed to him, but he somehow felt it would be more satisfying to plunge the ice pick into a firm, smooth, young belly this time, rather than one that was soft and sagging. A young woman, yes, with resilient, snow-white skin. As soon as Kawashima made up his mind on this point, he began to ache with desire for an older woman. The whiskey-fueled revelation that the victim should be young, after the excitement of writing out all those notes, had left him helpless with lust. Rationalizing that unless he did something about it, he'd never get any sleep, which would only hinder his ability to begin preparations tomorrow, he leafed through the sex guide and dialed a place that advertised erotic massage by mature ladies. Good evening, Essence Clinic. It was a man's voice. I'm at a hotel in the city. Is it too late to ask for a massage? He'd never called a place like this before and was surprised at how calm he managed to sound. Which hotel, sir? The Akasaka Prince. Thank you. If I may ask your room number, we'll ring you right back to confirm. About 10 seconds after he hung up, the phone rang. Sorry to keep you waiting. The man had an odd way of intoning his words. We have a 38-year-old widow who is available immediately. The voice was tranquil and mechanical, and gave no sense of the person producing it. It was impossible even to imagine what the man's face looked like. Kawashima didn't answer right away, and the voice continued. If you wouldn't mind waiting another hour or so, however, we can send a lady in her early 40s. No. Send the one who can come right now, please. The basic massage is 7,000 yen, and the erotic version is 17,000. Which would you prefer? It sounded as if the man were holding a baby as he talked, or sitting at someone's deathbed. Kawashima pictured a shriveled, comatose old man hooked up to an IV drip. Erotic. She'll be at your room in approximately half an hour. Of course, we ask you to supply her with taxi fare both ways. Before hanging up, Kawashima ventured to ask if they got many young men requesting these older women. Quite a few, the smooth voice said, and replaced the receiver so quietly that he scarcely heard the click. What if it turned out to be her? It had been just 10 years now, so she'd be 48. The voice had said the woman was a decade younger than that, but it's not unusual for women in the sex trade to lie about their age. In fact, at the strip clubs where she was working back then, she told people she was 28. How many men could really distinguish 10 years one way or the other, after all? If it did turn out to be her, though, what should he say? Would there still be a small round scar, or would it have healed completely by now? They'd spoken very little after she was released from hospital, but he clearly remembered her mentioning how complicated and time-consuming the treatment was for an ice pick wound. An unbelievable pain in the ass, to use her exact words. Well, he wasn't holding any grudges. If it turned out to be her, All he needed to say was, "Long time no see," and maybe ask about the scar. He decided to allow himself a little more whiskey. After all, his urge to call an S&M club had vanished now that the 38-year-old was on her way. He opened the third miniature bottle and poured it into his glass, his mind replaying the smooth voice's last words. Quite a few. Beyond the window pane, veiled with condensation, was the glittering expanse of late-night Tokyo. From up here, the people on the street looked like moving dots. He'd recently watched a daytime talk show with the theme, "Young Men Who Can Love Only Women Their Mother's Age." A psychologist in a bow tie had expounded that it's a perversion of sorts, certainly, an elaboration of the so-called Peter Pan syndrome, and though the symptoms are distinct, the pathology is basically the same as that of young men who sexually molest little girls. Neither type has the ability to make or maintain normal, healthy relationships. In other words, men who are attracted to much older women were sick and abnormal. If I accomplish my mission, Kawashima thought to himself, I'll go after that psychologist next, for talking such absolute shit. The boys in the home had rarely spoken to one another. He'd roomed with Taku-chan for 2 years, but it was only shortly before he was released from the place that they'd had conversations of any length, and not even then had they discussed anything very personal. Kawashima tried to picture the boys in the home, to see them with his 29-year-old eyes. The playroom, its sandbox filled with white sand, all the different dolls and stuffed animals and puppets, the model tanks and cars and toy telephones, the building blocks, the little trampoline, the painting supplies, the children. He managed to envision the entire scene quite vividly. It was as if his adult self were actually standing there watching the kids. Every imaginable trait that would make an adult despise a child could be found in someone in that room. 100 out of 100 grown-ups, being in close quarters with one of these children, would end up with a single thought. What an insufferable little monster. These kids wouldn't say hello or answer when you spoke to them. Call to a boy repeatedly, and he'd turn and stare you down, saying something like, "Shut up, asshole, I heard you the first time." Reprimand another, and he'd go feral, throwing things and breaking toys and trying to bite your hand. Many of them ate like animals, even snatching food away from others. There were some who'd curl up in a corner, staring blankly into space, only to explode into tears if anyone came near, and others as obsequious as slaves or dogs, anxiously peering up into the attendants' faces and awaiting orders. There were little girls who would snuggle up to any grown man and try to guide his hand inside their underwear, and there were kids who compulsively bit their own arms. Kids who would suddenly start twitching and banging their heads against a wall, not even stopping when the blood ran down their faces. Kids who waddled around oblivious to the stinking load in their own pants. Watching children like this, it was all too easy to see why their parents beat them. It was only natural to hate such kids, to ignore them, and shower only your other children with love. Who wouldn't? But of course, that wasn't the way it really worked. Such behaviors weren't the reasons parents abuse children, but the results of abuse. Children are powerless, Kawashima muttered to himself. The tears rolling down his cheeks took him by surprise, and he finished the glass of whiskey in one gulp. No matter how viciously they're beaten, children were powerless to do anything about it. Even if mother hit them with a shoehorn or the hose of a vacuum cleaner or the handle of a kitchen knife, or strangled them, or poured boiling water on them, they couldn't escape her. They couldn't even truly despise her. Children would struggle desperately to feel love for their parents. Rather than hate a parent, in fact, they'd choose to hate themselves. Love and violence became so intertwined for them that when they grew up and got into relationships, only hysteria could set their hearts at ease. Kindness, gentleness, anything along those lines just caused tension, since there was no telling when it would turn to overt hostility. Better to cut right to the chase by constantly eliciting disgust and anger. The asshole with the bow tie had referred to victims of that sort of upbringing as perverts and wrote them off as pathological. Focusing alternately on his own reflection in the bedewed window and the nightscape of Tokyo at his feet, Kawashima began to think of himself as a representative of all the children who'd become insignificant dots in that dark diorama, a martyr armed with only an ice pick, facing down the enemy hordes. Flushed with a sense of omnipotence, he summoned up the faces of the children in the home one by one and told them, "Just wait and see." His lips grazed the window pane, and several drops of water ran down the glass like little bugs scattering. "I'll kill them all for you," Kawashima muttered again and again. 6. "You remind me of somebody," the masseuse said. "I can't remember the name, but some actor. Do you know who I mean?" She was a big-boned woman who talked a lot. She looked so little like the woman he'd stabbed 10 years ago that Kawashima couldn't suppress a wry smile when he first saw her. She wore slacks of a thin, glittery material, a gaudy sweater, and a silver fox half-coat. Kawashima had, as a matter of fact, been told that he looked like certain actors or singers before, but he was sure his resemblance to any celebrity was too tenuous to be fatal, especially if he changed his hairstyle and wore glasses. He offered the woman something to drink. She asked for a glass of beer, and he got one for her and another for himself. Sipping at his beer, Kawashima asked her if it wasn't dangerous going to the hotel rooms of men she'd never met. "Usually, you can tell if a guy's okay just by looking in his eyes, so I haven't had any real problems personally. But some of the girls have had bad experiences. I don't mean anything really scary, but like letting guys stick their dirty fingers in there to make a little extra money and ending up with an infection or whatever. That's the sort of thing you hear about anyway." Kawashima stripped, dimmed the lights, and lay face down on top of the bedspread. The woman sat on the side of the bed and lightly ran her fingernails over his back and buttocks and hamstrings, tracing leisurely circles on the surface of his skin. He felt like a patient being pampered by a nurse. As she helped ease him over onto his back, the woman was telling him about the man she lived with, explaining that he was the one who'd bought her the fur half-coat. She placed a box of tissues next to her on the bed and rubbed oil into her left palm, then began stroking his already erect penis. He lifted his head from the pillow and asked if she wasn't going to undress as well. Without pausing the motion of her hand, she told him it would cost an extra 10,000. "I'll pay it," he said, and she wiped her hand with a tissue, reminded him that he mustn't touch her, and wriggled out of her clothing. Wanting to get a better look at her soft belly and the marks left by the elastic of her pantyhose, he switched on the bedside lamp. The woman made no attempt to conceal her body. It was a body that stirred nostalgic feelings in him. Skin your fingers could sink into, breasts with visible veins and dark, downcast nipples, arms and waist and thighs that jiggled with the slightest movement. The pathos of pubic hair, the cracked, yellowed nail of a big toe. He'd once been so accustomed to this sort of body that when he first slept with Yoko, the firmness of her flesh actually felt strange to him. Yoko was now 29 and had given birth to a child, but when you touched her neck or arm or ass, the flesh still pressed back. Looking at the supposedly 38-year-old ass flattened against the bedspread, Kawashima thought, "There's something non-threatening about skin like this. Soft as a sponge cake left over from Christmas. Skin that yielded to your touch rather than resisting defiantly. It was as if the very cells were conscious of their age and had ceased to assert themselves." He was drinking this body in with his eyes when he came. The woman wiped him off with a hot, wet towel. After handing her over 30,000 yen and sending her on her way, he lay back on the bedspread, still naked. He was enveloped in a sort of weightless tranquility that was like nothing he'd ever experienced before, far from any danger of his nervous system going haywire. Kawashima had never understood the how or why of those episodes of his, the explosions of shock and terror and rage, the total loss of control, but they always left him feeling miserable afterwards. He'd often wondered if one couldn't train oneself to develop nerves that wouldn't crack like that. But the reality, he thought, staring up at the ceiling, is that I'll probably have to go through this sort of thing forever. He'd just spurted a large volume of semen, and though it had occasioned him no more excitement than a good sneeze, he was enjoying the after effects. It felt good just lying there gazing at the ceiling. He was aware that the good feeling existed side by side with a chilling sort of loneliness, but even that wasn't all bad. He was picturing the masseuse's bulky thighs when something important occurred to him, and he sat up in bed and reached for his briefcase. He opened it, took out the notes, and added a couple of lines. The woman must be not only young but petite. A large woman would be more difficult to control in the event of any unforeseen glitches.